The room was full of noise when my marriage ended. 60 years together, and it didn't end in a hospital room or a quiet argument at night. It ended under bright lights, surrounded by people who had watched us grow old. Plates clinked, someone laughed too loudly, then everything stopped. My husband stood up to make his anniversary speech. I remember the smell of flowers mixed with warm food. I remember the way my ring felt heavier than usual on my finger. I remember smiling, because that's what you do after 60 years. You smile on instinct. You smile even before you know why. He cleared his throat. His voice sounded calm, too calm. He said my name, and in that moment I felt something shift. Not fear, not yet, just a strange pressure in my chest, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to. He talked about loyalty, about truth, about how time has a way of demanding honesty before it's too late. People nodded. They thought this was wisdom, romance, a long marriage reflected back at them like a mirror they hoped to step into someday. Then he said one sentence that didn't belong there. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it landed inside me like a crack in glass. I felt my smile freeze while everyone else kept watching him. My ears started ringing, like the room had suddenly filled with water. I looked around, waiting for someone else to react, someone to tell me I'd misunderstood. No one did. I realized, sitting there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, that the man I had trusted since I was young was finally talking about something he had hidden from me for most of my life. Not a small thing, not a mistake, something foundational, something that made the last 60 years tilt, as if they were no longer solid memories, but props on a stage. I wanted to interrupt him. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to stand up and walk out. Instead, I stayed still. Because when you've built an entire life around one person, you don't immediately know who you are without them. And when the truth starts to surface after decades of silence, your first instinct isn't anger, it's confusion. I kept thinking the same question over and over as he continued speaking, as the room waited for a happy ending. Why now? Why, after 60 years of marriage, was he finally choosing today to tell the truth? When I met my husband, I was young enough to believe that love was something you earned by giving more of yourself. I didn't question it. That's how women were taught back then. Love meant sacrifice, patience, loyalty without conditions. And I gave all of it freely because I believed we were building something permanent. We didn't start with much: a small house, borrowed furniture, dreams that felt bigger than our bank account. I remember counting coins at the kitchen table while he slept, convincing myself that struggle was proof we were strong. I told myself that love was supposed to feel hard sometimes. As the years passed, I became the quiet center of our life. I raised our children, managed the home, and held everything together while he focused on work. I adjusted my dreams around his schedule. I delayed my wants so his plans could come first. I didn't resent it, at least not consciously, because I believed marriage was a shared investment. What was his was mine. What was mine belonged to us. And for a long time, it felt true. He was dependable, consistent, the kind of man people respected. Friends admired our marriage. Family held us up as an example of what lasting love looked like. 60 years doesn't just happen, they said. It takes trust. I trusted him completely. When doubts appeared, they were small enough to dismiss. A late night explained away by work, a conversation that ended too quickly when I entered the room, a look on his face that I couldn't quite read. I told myself I was being dramatic. After decades together, you learn not to question every shadow. I chose peace over suspicion. Looking back now, that choice feels heavy, but at the time, it felt responsible. We had built too much to start pulling at loose threads. Our children were grown, our lives deeply entangled. Questioning him felt like questioning my own judgment, my own past. There were moments, though, that lingered longer than they should have. Birthdays where he felt distant, anniversaries where his eyes carried something unreadable. I would ask if everything was okay, and he'd smile and say yes, and I believed him because belief had become my role. We grew older together. Our bodies changed, our routines softened. Love became quieter, less demanding, wrapped in habit and shared history. I thought that was what long marriages turned into: less passion, more loyalty; less mystery, more certainty. I was proud of us. I told younger women that commitment was about endurance, that real love meant staying even when things felt dull or confusing. I spoke from experience, convinced that my life was proof. But beneath that calm surface, there were cracks I didn't want to see. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with an expression that didn't feel like love or familiarity. It felt like guilt. Other times, he'd grow strangely defensive over things that shouldn't have mattered. When I asked gentle questions, he'd change the subject or joke his way out of it. I told myself everyone has private thoughts. Everyone has pieces of themselves they don't share. 60 years together doesn't mean total transparency, I reasoned. It means choosing each other anyway. What I didn't know then was that trust, when stretched over decades without truth, doesn't disappear. It hardens. And when it finally cracks, it doesn't break quietly. It shatters. As I sat there during our anniversary celebration, listening to him speak about honesty, all those moments resurfaced at once, not as memories, but as warnings. And for the first time, I wondered if the marriage I had protected for 60 years had been protecting a lie instead. I didn't learn the truth in a dramatic confession or a tearful apology. It came quietly, almost carelessly, as if it were something I should have already known. After the anniversary celebration, people hugged us, congratulated us, told us how lucky we were. I nodded and smiled, still trapped inside that strange fog his words had created. My body moved through the motions while my mind replayed his sentence again and again, searching for a safer meaning. That night, when the house finally went quiet, I asked him what he meant. He didn't look surprised. That was the first real blow. He sat down across from me, tired but composed, as if he'd been preparing for this conversation longer than I'd been alive inside our marriage. There was no urgency in him, no fear, just a steady calm that made my stomach drop. He told me there was something from the beginning, something he never corrected, never clarified, and eventually let solidify into truth simply because I believed it. As he spoke, my mind fought back. I reminded myself of our life, our children, our years together. I told myself there had to be a misunderstanding, that words after 60 years could easily come out wrong. But then he said one detail that couldn't be undone. A name, a date, a moment from our early years that I remembered completely differently. It felt like the floor shifted beneath me. Memories I had trusted for decades suddenly felt unstable, like photographs that had been edited without my knowledge. I questioned myself first, not him. I searched my own past for mistakes, for places where I might have misunderstood or forgotten. That's what betrayal does. It convinces you that you're the unreliable one. He explained it in pieces, never all at once. Each sentence carried just enough information to hurt, but not enough to fully understand. I realized then that this wasn't new for him. He had lived with this version of the truth for so long that it no longer felt dangerous to him. To me, it felt suffocating. My chest tightened as I listened. I wanted to interrupt him, to stop the story before it went somewhere I couldn't follow, but I was afraid that if I stopped him, the truth would remain unfinished, hanging over me for the rest of my life. So I stayed silent. Inside, two voices battled each other. One begged me to defend him, to minimize what I was hearing, to protect the marriage I had built my identity around. The other voice whispered that something fundamental had been taken from me without my consent. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It resists. It tries to survive. I asked him why he never told me before. He said it didn't seem necessary. That answer hurt more than anything else. It meant the truth wasn't hidden out of fear of losing me. It was hidden because my right to know had never mattered enough. My life had been shaped around an omission that benefited him and cost me choice. As the conversation ended, there was no explosion, no shouting, just a heavy silence settling between us, thick and unfamiliar. The man I thought I knew sat in front of me, but he felt distant, almost like a stranger wearing my husband's face. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the young woman I once was, the one who believed love was built on honesty, the one who trusted without reservation. I wondered what choices she would have made if she'd known then what I knew now. And for the first time since that anniversary speech, a terrifying question took shape in my mind. If he could hide this for 60 years, what else had I never been told? After that night, nothing returned to normal, though on the surface everything looked exactly the same. We woke up, ate breakfast, followed our routines like two people who had rehearsed life together for decades. He read the paper, I washed the dishes. Our bodies moved out of habit, but something invisible now stood between us, a weight, a presence. Once you know a truth has been hidden from you, your mind starts searching for others. I replayed conversations from years ago, listening for what wasn't said. I thought about decisions we'd made together, moves, sacrifices, moments when my voice had been quiet because I believed I had all the information. Now I wasn't so sure. Small details began to bother me in ways they never had before. A locked drawer I'd never questioned. Old letters tucked away in a place I was never meant to look. Phone calls he took outside, his voice lowered just enough to feel intentional. None of these things were new. What was new was my inability to ignore them. The pressure built slowly, like water rising behind a wall. I wanted to ask questions, but every time I opened my mouth, I felt the weight of 60 years pressing down on me. What if I was wrong? What if digging deeper destroyed what little peace we had left? At our age, wasn't it better to let things rest? That's what fear sounds like when it wears the mask of wisdom. Family visits became uncomfortable. I watched faces more closely, searching for recognition, guilt, anything that told me I wasn't imagining this. Sometimes I caught looks exchanged that ended too quickly. Sometimes I noticed conversations stop when I entered the room. I told myself I was being paranoid, but paranoia doesn't come from nothing. It grows from inconsistency, from gaps where truth should be. The hardest part wasn't anger, it was helplessness. I felt trapped by time. 60 years of shared history isn't something you walk away from easily. Our finances were intertwined. Our children's lives were built on the foundation of our marriage. Questioning him felt like pulling a thread that could unravel everything. And yet, doing nothing felt worse. At night, I lay awake listening to him breathe, wondering how someone could share a bed with you for decades while holding a secret that big. I questioned my own judgment, my own intelligence. Had I been naive, or had I trusted because trust was the only way to survive? The doubts followed me everywhere. In the grocery store, on walks around the neighborhood, in quiet moments when memories surfaced uninvited. Happy moments now carried a shadow, like they were incomplete or slightly distorted. I began to feel like I was living in a version of my life that wasn't fully mine. The tension reached a point where silence became unbearable. I knew there was more. His careful explanations, his vague answers, the way he avoided specifics all pointed to something deeper. The truth he'd offered felt edited, curated to cause the least disruption. But truth doesn't work that way. Once it starts to surface, it demands to be fully seen. I felt myself shrinking, becoming cautious, measuring every word. I hated that version of myself. I had spent my life being strong, dependable, the one others leaned on. Now I felt like I was standing on unstable ground, waiting for it to give way. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the house we'd lived in for decades, it became clear that I couldn't carry this uncertainty forever. Not knowing was slowly erasing me. Whatever he was still hiding, it had already changed me, and I knew that if I didn't push for answers soon, the truth wouldn't just remain hidden, it would control the rest of my life. I chose a moment when the house was quiet, when there would be no interruptions and no excuses to escape. The kind of silence that forces honesty or exposes its absence. I told him we needed to talk. He sighed before I even finished the sentence, as if my need for clarity was an inconvenience he'd already grown tired of. That reaction hurt more than anger would have. Anger at least acknowledges impact. His weariness suggested something worse, that my pain had become predictable to him. I asked him directly what else he had kept from me. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the table between us, tracing a familiar groove in the wood with his finger. That table had held birthday cakes, school projects, late-night talks. Now it felt like a barrier. When he finally spoke, his words were careful. Too careful. He said I was focusing on the past, that bringing everything back up would only cause unnecessary damage. He reminded me of our age, our history, how much we had already survived together. It sounded reasonable. That's what made it cruel. I pressed him harder, asking for details he had avoided before. Names, timelines, choices. Each question tightened something in his expression. Not fear, irritation. That was when I realized the truth wasn't just hidden, it was protected. He told me I was overreacting, that everyone has secrets, that after 60 years, some things shouldn't matter anymore. His tone shifted, growing sharper, less patient. One sentence landed like a slap. He implied that my loyalty should outweigh my need to know. In that moment, something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I saw him differently. Not as the man who had shared a life with me, but as someone who believed my devotion had earned him silence, as if my years of sacrifice were a guarantee that I would accept whatever version of reality he offered. I felt humiliated, not just betrayed, but underestimated. The argument didn't escalate into shouting. It became colder than that, detached. He spoke as though this conversation was a problem to manage, not a wound to acknowledge. He minimized, he redirected, he avoided responsibility with practiced ease. I asked him if he ever thought about how his choices affected me. He said he didn't want to hurt me. That answer made my hands tremble, because it meant the pain I was experiencing now was something he had knowingly postponed, not prevented. He had chosen comfort over honesty, assuming I would never confront him this late in life. I stood up, suddenly unable to sit there any longer. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. I felt close to something dangerous, not violence, but collapse. The kind of emotional breaking point you don't come back from unchanged. I told him I deserved the full truth. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried a faint edge of mockery, as if my demand was unrealistic, even naive, as if I were asking for too much after already giving everything. That was the moment I understood how alone I truly was in that marriage. This wasn't just about what he had hidden, it was about how little he respected my right to my own life story. I walked away from the conversation feeling smaller, but also clearer. The man I was confronting wasn't going to volunteer the truth. Whatever remained hidden would stay that way unless something forced it into the light. As I stood in another room trying to steady my breathing, one thought became unavoidable. If I wanted answers, they wouldn't come from him, and whatever was coming next would change everything we had left.
The truth didn't come from him. It came on an ordinary afternoon, in a way so unexpected that at first I didn't understand what it was offering me. I was sorting through old paperwork, the kind of task you do when you're trying to keep your hands busy so your thoughts don't spiral. Years of documents, photos, and forgotten envelopes, a physical record of a life lived mostly on trust. That's when I found something that didn't belong. It wasn't dramatic, just a single item tucked where it shouldn't have been. Old, yellowed, deliberately hidden. The kind of thing you only keep if it matters enough to protect. My heart started beating faster before I even knew why. As I looked closer, dates began to line up in a way they never had before. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but close enough to confirm what my instincts had been warning me about. This wasn't an isolated secret. It was part of something larger. Something carefully managed over time. I sat down because my legs suddenly felt weak. What I held in my hands didn't tell the entire story, but it confirmed one thing with absolute clarity. I hadn't imagined any of it. The inconsistencies, the evasions, the unease that had followed me since the anniversary. I wasn't losing my mind. For decades, I had trusted my husband to be the narrator of our shared history. Now I was seeing proof that the story had been edited without my consent. And once that realization settled in, something inside me shifted. Fear gave way to focus. I started looking differently at everything around me, not as a wife protecting a marriage, but as a woman trying to understand her own life. I revisited moments that once felt insignificant, viewing them through this new lens. Patterns emerged. Absences that had been explained away, decisions that now carried different weight. The power dynamic changed quietly. I no longer felt desperate for his approval or explanation. I felt determined to see the truth fully, even if it hurt, especially if it hurt, because the pain of knowing would be temporary. The pain of living in uncertainty had already lasted too long. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, not to accuse, not to confront, but to ask a careful question. One question led to another. Each answer didn't give me closure, but it gave me direction. Pieces began to align. The story he had given me all those years ago no longer held, and the more I learned, the more I understood why he had worked so hard to keep it buried. This wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about controlling the narrative until the very end. For the first time since this began, I felt steady. Not calm, not healed, but grounded. I realized that I had spent my life being patient, accommodating, willing to compromise for the sake of harmony. That instinct had served my family well, but it had cost me my voice. Now that voice was returning. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't seeking public humiliation. What I wanted was something far more powerful: clarity. The kind of clarity that can't be argued with or dismissed as emotion. The kind that stands on its own, undeniable. As evening approached, I knew there was no turning back. The truth was no longer abstract or theoretical. It had shape, it had weight, and soon it would demand to be acknowledged. I looked around the house we had shared for 60 years and felt a strange mix of grief and resolve. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be the woman waiting for permission to understand her own life. The truth was moving toward the surface, and when it finally emerged, it would change more than just my marriage. I didn't confront him immediately. The truth deserved more than a rushed argument in a quiet room. It deserved space, air, witness. Not for revenge, but because secrets survive best in silence. The moment came when family gathered again, drawn together by routine and obligation. Familiar faces, familiar smiles. the same setting where everything had begun to fracture. I felt the weight of 60 years pressing against my back, but this time I wasn't carrying it alone. I had facts now, not assumptions, not suspicions, facts that connected names, dates, and decisions into a single, undeniable timeline, a life that had been running parallel to mine, hidden in plain sight. When I spoke, my voice surprised me. It didn't shake, it didn't rise. It was steady, grounded in something stronger than anger. I laid out what I knew, piece by piece, not emotionally, clearly. Each detail landed with its own weight, forcing the room into stillness. Faces shifted, eyes widened. Someone inhaled sharply. No one interrupted me. I watched him as I spoke. For the first time since this began, he looked unprepared. The calm confidence he had worn for decades slipped. His expression tightened as he realized there was no version of the story left that could protect him. The truth had outgrown his control. What I revealed wasn't just a single betrayal. It was a sustained choice, a decision made early in our marriage that shaped everything that followed. A truth he had withheld not once, but continuously. Every day he chose comfort over honesty. The realization spread through the room like a slow shockwave. I felt it then, the full emotional impact, not as a sudden explosion, but as a release, the kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. 60 years of confusion, self-doubt, and quiet justification finally had a name. This wasn't my failure. It never had been. As the final piece fell into place, something else happened, something unexpected. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity, clean and sharp. The truth didn't just expose him, it restored me. He tried to speak, to explain, to soften what could no longer be softened. But explanations sound different when they come too late. What stood out most wasn't the reaction of others, it was my own. I wasn't shrinking, I wasn't apologizing for asking questions. I was standing in my life, fully aware of where it had been altered without my consent. Justice didn't arrive as punishment or humiliation, it arrived as recognition. The truth was now shared, and because of that, it could no longer be rewritten. The version of our marriage I had carried alone was finally visible to everyone else. I looked at him and understood something deeply important. Whatever love had once existed between us had been built on a foundation that wasn't honest. And while I couldn't reclaim the years lost to that lie, I could reclaim my understanding of them. The climax wasn't his exposure, it was my freedom from confusion. As silence settled again, heavier than before, but honest this time, I knew one thing with certainty. The truth had finally been told, and nothing, no explanation, no regret, no history could take that power away from me. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic fallout, no shouting, no public sides taken. What happened instead was slower, heavier, and far more real. The truth had settled into everyone's awareness, and with it came a shift that couldn't be undone. People spoke to me differently, not with pity, but with understanding. For the first time, I wasn't being celebrated for endurance, I was being respected for honesty. My husband changed too. Not in the way stories promise. There was no sudden transformation, no grand apology that erased decades of silence. What changed was his certainty. The control he had carried for so long was gone. The story was no longer his alone to manage. And in that loss of control, the imbalance between us finally corrected itself. We spoke again later, not to relive the past, but to acknowledge it fully. The conversation was calmer than any we'd had before because the truth no longer needed defending. It simply existed. I listened without bending myself to make things easier for him. I spoke without fear of causing discomfort. That alone felt like justice. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments, sleeping through the night,
breathing without that constant tightness in my chest, remembering my younger self without shame. I allowed myself to grieve not just the betrayal, but the version of my life I thought I was living. Grief, I learned, isn't a sign of weakness, it's proof that something mattered. I began to see my past differently, not as wasted time, but as a life lived with integrity, even if it wasn't met with the same honesty. My loyalty hadn't been foolish, it had been real. The lie belonged to him, not to me. What stayed with me most was a sense of self-respect I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need public sympathy. I needed my story back. And I had it. At this stage of life, peace doesn't come from pretending things didn't hurt. It comes from knowing exactly what did and choosing to stand anyway. I couldn't change the 60 years behind me, but I could decide how the truth lived inside me moving forward. I chose clarity over comfort. I chose myself. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real lived experiences. Share this with someone who needs the courage to face the truth, and leave a comment. Your voice matters more than you think.